Anne Hathaway versus dinosaurs. Honestly, you probably don't need more of a sales pitch than that, but what surprised me about The End of Oak Street is that there's actually a lot more going on here. This is a thrilling, surprisingly funny survival movie with a family that I genuinely cared about, some really effective sequences of dread, and a mystery that went in a direction that I did not expect. Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, this is Jason from EskimoTV.net, your local high school educator and Tomato Meter approved film critic. Today I'm reviewing The End of Oak Street. Now, I don't think this is quite on the level of something like Weapons or even Obsession from earlier this year. I'd probably put it more on the playing field of The Long Walk, another movie with a really fun horror premise that takes a relatively simple idea and executes it well. And The End of Oak Street is definitely a movie that I would recommend. The film is written and directed by David Robert Mitchell, who gave us It Follows, and stars Anne Hathaway as Denise and Ewan McGregor.
Ewan McGregor.
And Ewan McGregor as her husband Greg.
Ewan McGregor
as her husband Greg. And before we get dinosaurs, the movie does something very important. It makes us care about this family. Denise and Greg are having marital problems. They're still together. They clearly still love each other, but there's this distance that has developed between them. And I appreciated that the movie doesn't portray their relationship as simply two people who can't stand one another. It's sadder and more complicated than that. These are two people who have built a life together, have children together, and still have a connection, but they're struggling. And I think anybody who's been married or even just been in a long-term relationship that has gone through a difficult period is probably going to recognize something in that. Anne Hathaway and Ewan McGregor are equally strong here, and I completely bought them as a married couple. Greg is doing everything he can to keep his family safe, while also desperately trying to remain optimistic for his children. There are moments where Denise is basically pressuring him to stop sugarcoating what's happening and be honest with the kids, while Greg is coming from the perspective of a father who doesn't necessarily know what's happening himself and doesn't want his children to completely lose hope. But I found Denise particularly interesting because there's another part of her life that her family doesn't really know about. She's secretly writing a book. It's something she's passionate about, but it's also become somewhat of an escape for her. And there's a really sad moment involving that writing later in the movie that tells us a lot about how important it has become to her. The screenplay even establishes this immediately. The movie opens with Denise receiving encouragement about her writing from an older woman who's been reading her work, telling Denise she'd like to see the next draft. One of my problems with some horror movies is when you're in the middle of a genuinely frightening sequence and suddenly somebody cracks a joke that completely destroys the tension. It kind of all begins to just fall apart. The End of Oak Street doesn't have that problem. Even later, when the family is in genuine danger, the movie finds comedy in the absurdity of what's happening without making the danger itself feel like a joke. And once this movie wants to be scary, it can be a little scary. Eventually, the family experiences this enormous bright light accompanied by a strange pressure change and a complete power outage. Their ears pop. The phones aren't working, the entire neighborhood has gone dark, and suddenly everything becomes eerily quiet. The family initially does what most of us would probably do. They rationalize it. Maybe it's lightning, maybe a transformer blew, maybe there's down power lines, but slowly they begin realizing that something is very wrong. And eventually there are dinosaurs roaming throughout their neighborhood. And from here, the movie becomes this incredibly fun survival story. David Robert Mitchell gets some really good mileage out of the creatures. I wouldn't necessarily say that the dinosaurs themselves reinvent anything, but they serve their purpose effectively. There were a couple of sequences that genuinely had me squirming in my seat. There's one in particular involving Denise being chased by one of the largest dinosaurs we've seen up until this point. She makes it onto the front patio of a house, and this thing lunges towards her. Its mouth comes inches away from eating her. Her entire family is watching this unfold, and what happens during this sequence becomes one of the movie's most emotionally devastating moments. I'm obviously not going to tell you what happens, but that was probably one of the points where the movie had me the most. There's another sequence that might be even better because of how differently it builds tension. A gigantic, almost snake-like prehistoric creature gets inside this family's house. It's like a giant snake. And somehow nobody notices it. This is another example of the movie being funny. The family is going about their business. Someone's using the restroom. Someone else is packing food. Someone else is packing clothes. And meanwhile, you just see this enormous giant snake slither its way throughout every portion of this house, from room to room to room. Throughout this entire house. It's suspenseful because we, the audience, are waiting for somebody to finally encounter this thing, but it's also weirdly hilarious watching how close everybody keeps coming to discovering it. And that's exactly what I mean when I say this movie understands how to balance that humor and dread. The joke isn't somebody looking at the dinosaur and delivering some clever one-liner. The situation itself is really funny, and yet you're still thinking, oh my goodness, is somebody about to walk into this thing? By the time somebody finally notices this giant snake, I was squirming, wondering how they were going to get out of this circumstance. Michael Giacchino's score helps tremendously with these sequences because he brings both suspense and this emotional sense of dread to what's happening. And visually, I really liked the movie as well. It's set in the 80s, and I think the period is captured nicely without the movie constantly pointing at things and screaming, hey, remember the 80s? And the visual effects on the dinosaurs are strong. They're convincing enough that I stopped thinking about the CGI and started thinking about whether these characters were going to get eaten. That's exactly what I needed from them. But I think that the other reason this movie works so well is its pacing. At around an hour and 40 minutes, the end of Oak Street doesn't overstay its welcome. The first 15 minutes or so are mostly about getting to know these people. Then we get the inciting incident. But even after that, the movie doesn't immediately go, dinosaurs, run for your lives. We spend another chunk of time with these characters trying to understand what's happening. And I really enjoyed that part, because the movie allows its mystery to unravel alongside its characters. They don't know what happened, we don't know what happened, and every new piece of information makes the situation stranger. Then once the survival portion kicks into gear, the movie keeps evolving instead of giving us essentially the same chase sequence over and over again. And I really don't want to say much more about the plot because the mystery is a real part of the fun. I didn't know exactly what caused this dinosaur immersion into their street. I didn't know where the story was going, and most importantly, I didn't know how the hell this movie was going to end. That was exciting. I'm sure there's some cinephile watching this right now who's going, Jason, they stole that entire idea from that obscure movie from 1974. If that's you, please tell me in the comments what movie they ripped off or were inspired by, because to me, this was a very original premise. But I personally haven't seen a movie that used this exact combination of ideas before. That bright white light, the strange pressure change, the power outage, and this gradual realization that these characters are no longer living in the same world that they were once living in moments before. I thought that was riveting. And without spoiling anything, the movie eventually does explore why this is happening. And I was really satisfied with that answer, which once again, I will not spoil. More importantly, the final act does something that I genuinely wasn't expecting. There were several possibilities running through my head for how David Robert Mitchell could possibly resolve this story. And I didn't guess it. The ending manages to bring the movie's science fiction concept and its family story together in a way that I found surprisingly satisfying. That's all I'm going to say, because this is one of those movies where I think you're better off not knowing where it's headed. So what's holding the end of Oak Street back from an A for me? Ironically, I think its biggest limitation is also part of its appeal. It's pretty simple. This is ultimately a relatively contained survival story about a struggling family being thrown into an absolutely insane situation, and the movie executes that premise very well. But it never quite reaches that next level for me where I'm sitting there thinking, I cannot believe this movie just did that. And that's the difference between something like this and something like Weapons for me. Weapons gave me those huge, audacious moments that immediately became some of my favorite moments of the year. The end of Oak Street doesn't quite reach those same peaks, but honestly, it doesn't really do much wrong either. This is a well-paced, well-acted, surprisingly funny survival movie with good visual effects, some legitimately tense dinosaur sequences, a compelling central mystery, and most importantly, characters I actually wanted to see make it out alive. David Robert Mitchell takes what could have simply been Anne Hathaway fights dinosaurs in the 80s and gives it enough heart, humor, and mystery to make it considerably more interesting than that description suggests. It's not Weapons, it's not quite Obsession, but if you enjoyed something like The Long Walk and you're looking for another fun genre movie with a great premise that doesn't waste your time, I definitely recommend checking this one out. For the end of Oak Street, I'm going to give it a B. And that'll do it for my review of The End of Oak Street. If you enjoyed this review, consider smashing that like button. You can also consider subscribing to this channel if you want to see more reviews like this in your feed. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, this is Jason from EskimoTV.net.